Hey howdy hey, how is everybody doing and welcome back to Disney Daily. Buzz Lightyear is an undeniably popular character that everyone wanted to know more about when Toy Story first hit the theaters. And because of all that curiosity, Pixar finally made a movie that they knew fans would be dying to see. In the newest film, Lightyear, we learn all about the fictional man who inspired the toy doll that would become a must-have to Andy. We get to see firsthand where the toy Buzz got his sayings, his mannerisms, and even his dislike for the evil Emperor Zurg. We learn so much about Buzz Lightyear's backstory, and we get a better understanding for why Buzz is the way that he is. For example, his commitment to completing a mission. This is something that is incredibly important to Buzz. In fact, it is arguably the most important thing. He won't stop until he has achieved his goals. He is extremely dedicated and determined, which is something I admired most about Buzz after seeing this new film. Learning all about his personality then gave me a better understanding for the toy Buzz that we know from Toy Story. After all, this toy is supposed to be an exact mini replica of him, and he is exactly that. The most obvious example happens when Buzz first lands in Andy's room. Buzz was very determined to complete his mission of defeating Zurg, despite all of Woody's warnings that he was just a toy. So with all this new insight to the character Buzz, I couldn't help but wonder about my favorite character from the franchise, and that is Woody. I kept thinking to myself I always thought we would get a Woody backstory or prequel before we got a Buzz Lightyear one, because to me, Woody is the heart and soul of Toy Story. But to my surprise, we got a Lightyear backstory first, but even though Buzz's story came first, I thought to myself, perhaps this opens the door to a Woody film. After all, I would argue that after this movie gave more insight to one of the iconic toys in the duo, that fans would now want and expect to know more about the other. So in today's video, I am going to explain what direction I think Pixar should take in terms of a Woody origin story. And let me tell you, it is a story that has already been written and has existed for years. But before I get into that, let me first take you through my thought process before I researched and arrived at my answer. You see, initially, when I started thinking about Woody's backstory, I kept thinking to myself, there's no way he had a past prior to Andy. And I thought that mostly due to the fact that Woody has never revealed any past life to us in any of the Toy Story films. The happy-go-lucky Andy has always been Woody's past, present, and future. But then as I started rewatching the films, I remembered how toys could be rebooted, so I began to think perhaps that was something that could have happened to Woody. As you all may or may not recall, a reboot was something that could happen to toys, and the best example of that is in Toy Story 3, when Lotso Huggenbear and his motley crew reboot Buzz and completely erase his memory. So I thought if it could happen to Buzz, could it have happened to Woody? Is it possible that his entire past life with another child was wiped out? I mean, anything is possible, right? But then I started to think about how I have no evidence really to support that, and on top of that, ideally I think Pixar would want to tell an origin story that they have already hinted at or set up, rather than starting completely from scratch. Kinda like what they did with Buzz and his whole Star Command and Zurg connections. This thought process then led me to my favorite movie of the franchise, Toy Story 2, when we are introduced to Woody's Roundup. Now, for those that may have forgotten, here's a little refresher about Toy Story 2. Now, in Toy Story 2, after Woody is stolen by Al, he is taken back to his apartment and is immediately met by company, that being Jessie, Bullseye, and Stinky Pete. It is during this interaction that Stinky Pete says, "It's good to see you, Woody," to which Woody responds, "How do you know my name?" "Why, you don't know who you are, do you?" Stinky Pete replies. It is then that Stinky Pete cues Bullseye to turn on all of the lights which reveal a display. But not just any ordinary display. A display all dedicated to Woody and the show he was featured in from the 1950s called Woody's Roundup. It is then that the theme song from the hit show begins to play on the TV. Stinky Pete explains to Woody that the show was unfortunately canceled due to two words, Sputnik. So now that we have had our little refresher, let me get into Woody's backstory. And let me preface this by saying that this entire story was apparently very legitimate and from a trustworthy source. You see, according to several sources online, a man by the name of Mike Mozart, who was a toy collector and used to work for Disney, revealed that his friend, Pixar animator Joe Ranft, told him the backstory of our favorite cowboy that apparently does exist, we just never got to see it. And before I tell you all I want to preface this by saying that one of the Toy Story writers, Andrew Stanton, has said this story isn't true. However, I think it is almost too perfect of a backstory to be completely fabricated, but I'll let you all decide for yourself. So according to this backstory, Woody was originally owned by not the Andy we know, but by Andy's father, Andy Sr. Yep, you heard that right. Andy's father's name was Andy. And the Andy that we see written underneath Woody's boot was written by Andy Sr. many, many, many years ago. So how exactly did Woody come into Andy Sr.'s possession? Was he given as a gift? Did he find him? Well, there is an explanation for that. According to the story, Andy Sr. was a really big fan of the famous TV show Woody's Roundup, which was the TV show I just talked about. The show was having a big contest, and the winner was to receive their very own personal Sheriff Woody doll. Now, in order to enter the contest, contestants had to submit 30 box tops from cereal boxes, specifically Cowboy Crunchies. Unfortunately, Andy Sr. was not able to get these cereal boxes because his family was extremely poor and could not afford them. But Andy Sr. did not give up on his dream of owning his very own Woody doll. So he wrote a heartfelt letter to the cereal company explaining why they should choose him and what winning Woody would mean to him. And as it turns out, that letter won over the contest officials and they selected Andy Sr. as the winner of the Woody prototype doll. It is extremely important to note that this was the first and last Sheriff Woody doll because Woody's Roundup would be canceled shortly after the competition due to, as Stinky Pete mentions, Sputnik. Due to this boom in all things space related, the Woody dolls were never manufactured. But the story doesn't end there, because what would Pixar be without a sad, heart-wrenching moment? So Andy Sr. develops polio, which was a very common disease at the time in the States. And because of this disease, he needs to be sent off to a special hospital, and all of his possessions were to be burned to prevent the spread. And yes, that meant Woody too. But Andy Sr. prevents that from happening because he couldn't stand the idea of his favorite toy going up in flames. So one night, he takes Woody plus 2 other toys who happen to be Slinky and Mr. Potato Head and locks them away in a box in the attic. And from what the story leads me to believe, he never touches that box ever again. Now, eventually, Andy Sr. recovers from polio, grows up, gets married to Andy's mom, and has his son, Andy, the one we know and love. However, this happy ending takes a turn and Andy Sr.'s polio returns and he passes away. But before he passes, he hands over a very special key to his son and tells him that his childhood best friend is waiting in the attic for him and he just has to take really good care of him. So after Andy Sr. passes, Andy goes into the attic, unlocks the box, and finds Woody, Slinky, and Potato Head. But because the toys had been asleep for so many years from being unused, they have no concept of how much time has actually passed. And they think that Andy is Andy Sr. because Andy Sr. and Andy look identical to one another. So the toys believe that this is their original Andy, and in their minds, nothing has changed. A year then passes and we arrive at the events in Toy Story, and that is the backstory that we never got to see. I honestly think this is the perfect prequel for Woody. I think there is so much potential in a movie like this, and I think it would be something all Toy Story fans would want to see, especially those like me who have always really loved Woody and rooted for him. But that concludes this video for the day. I hope you all enjoyed this one. I highly encourage you to leave your own theory or predictions on what a Woody prequel story would look like down in the comments. As always, thanks for being my guest here at Disney Daily. Until next time.